My neighbor accused me of stealing his fence and sued me for damages. In court, he said, she took it down without permission. I played video footage showing his fence blowing over in a storm, and him taking the panels for firewood. His lawyer packed up his files and left without another word. I never thought a fence would turn into a full-blown legal battle, but here we are. This all started because I had the misfortune of living next to Ron, not his real name, but it might as well be. The neighbor. My husband and I bought our house about 10 years ago in a quiet neighborhood in Boise, Idaho. It wasn't fancy, but we worked hard to keep it nice. We mowed our lawn, took care of the house, and kept to ourselves. Then 5 years ago, Ron moved in next door. From day one, we knew he was going to be a problem. His yard was a mess. Trash cans left out for weeks. Loud music blasting at all hours. He parked directly in front of my driveway all the time, even though he had space in front of his own house. At first, I tried to be nice. Maybe he just didn't realize he was being inconsiderate. So I waved. I made small talk. But Ron? He ignored me. Wouldn't even look at me. If he did acknowledge me, it was usually some passive-aggressive grunt. Fine. If he wanted to be that way, so be it. The fence that started it all. Between our properties was an old wooden fence. It had been there for years, probably as old as the houses themselves. The thing was falling apart. The wood was rotting, some panels were barely hanging on, and every time we had a storm, pieces of it would literally fall into my yard. Now, here's the important part, the fence was Ron's. It was on his side of the property line, which meant it was his responsibility. For the first couple of years after he moved in, I tried to be polite about it. Hey, Ron, the fence is getting worse. Any chance you're thinking of fixing it? Not my problem, he said. A year later, after a storm knocked down another chunk of the fence, I asked again. Ron, some of the fence fell into my yard again. It's pretty bad. Are you planning to repair it? Why should I? You care about it so much, you fix it. At that point, I knew there was no reasoning with him. He didn't care. Mother Nature does what Ron wouldn't. Then came the storm. It was late November, one of those early winter storms that roll in fast. Heavy winds, nearly 60 miles per hour, the kind that makes trees groan and sends garbage cans flying down the street. I woke up the next morning, looked out my back window, and saw that half of Ron's fence was gone. Not just damaged, completely flattened. A few pieces were in my yard, but most of it was on his side. I figured, well, maybe this will finally force him to do something about it. Nope. Caught in the act. That afternoon, I heard chopping sounds coming from Ron's backyard. Curious, I peeked over. He was cutting up the broken fence panels. At first, I thought, hey, maybe he's actually cleaning up the mess for once. But then I saw it, he was using the wood for firewood. I stood there, watching in shock as he stacked the broken pieces, chopped them up, and started a fire in his backyard pit. He didn't replace the fence. He didn't clean up the mess. He just burned the evidence. The lawsuit that made my blood boil. A couple of weeks later, I got a letter from a lawyer. Ron was suing me. According to his claim, I had intentionally removed his fence without permission and caused him $3,000 in damages. I laughed when I read it. Then I got angry. I knew Ron was a jerk, but this was next-level crazy. I called a lawyer of my own. She was just as confused as I was. So, he's claiming you took down a fence that you don't own? Yep. And you have security cameras? Yep. Oh, this is going to be fun. Gathering the evidence. I went through my security camera footage and found exactly what I needed. The video clearly showed the storm knocking over the fence. It showed the panels lying in Ron's yard, not mine. It showed Ron gathering the broken pieces, cutting them up, and using them for firewood. I also dug up my old text messages where I had repeatedly asked him to fix the fence, only for him to tell me, not my problem. We printed everything out. The video was saved to a USB drive. I was ready. The courtroom showdown. We get to court. Ron is sitting there, looking smug. His lawyer stands up and starts talking about how I maliciously destroyed his fence, and how he has suffered financial and emotional distress. The judge listens patiently, then turns to me. Do you have anything to say? I nod. Yes, Your Honor. I have video evidence. I pull out my laptop, connect it to the courtroom screen, and hit play. The first clip shows the storm rolling in. Trees bending, debris flying, then the fence topples over. The second clip shows Ron walking outside the next morning, looking at the fallen fence, then casually dragging the panels into his yard. The third clip? Him chopping up the fence and tossing it into his fire pit. Silence. I glance at Ron. His face is bright red. His lawyer is suddenly very interested in the floor. The judge leans forward. Mr. Ron, do you have anything to say about this? Ron stammers. Well, that's not, his lawyer packs up his files and just walks out. I've never seen anything like it. The judge exhales like he's trying not to laugh. Then he looks at me. Anything else, ma'am? Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to countersue for legal fees. Ron's face turns ghost white. The aftermath of the courtroom showdown. Ron sat frozen in his chair as his lawyer walked out on him. The judge was still staring at him, waiting for a response. Mr. Ron, do you have anything to say about this evidence? Ron swallowed hard. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Well. He shifted in his seat. That's not. The wind. The wind, the judge repeated, nodding. Yes, the wind. The same wind we just watched knock down your fence? Ron didn't answer. The judge sighed, clearly done with the nonsense. We will discuss the counterclaim. But for now, I see no evidence that the defendant removed your fence or caused you financial harm. Case dismissed. Just like that, it was over. Or so I thought. The new fence and the unfinished war. About a week later, I got a letter from the Homeowners Association. Ron had complained to them that I was the reason he no longer had a fence and that I was refusing to pay for a new one. I laughed. Loud. First, we weren't even in a mandatory HOA, just a loosely organized group of homeowners that liked to keep the neighborhood looking nice. Second, this was his fence, and third, wasn't he the one who had burned it for firewood? I went to the next HOA meeting, showed them the same security footage I'd used in court, and that was the end of that. They told Ron he had 30 days to build a new fence or face fines. I thought that was the last I'd hear of it. Nope. A few days later, I woke up to the sound of construction. I peeked outside and saw a bunch of random guys putting up a fence. Not a nice one, either. It was the cheapest chain-link fence money could buy. No privacy, no barrier, just an ugly metal grid standing where the old wooden fence had been. Ron stood outside, watching them work, arms crossed, a smug little grin on his face. I knew that look. He thought he'd won somehow. Fine. Let him have his ugly fence. I could plant some tall shrubs. Maybe put up some decorative panels on my side. No big deal. Then things started getting weird. The strange incidents begin. At first, it was small things. I'd take my trash cans out at night, and by morning, they'd be knocked over, only mine, never Ron's. My mail started going missing. Packages marked as delivered would mysteriously vanish. One morning, I came outside and found something smeared on my car windshield. It looked like mud, but smelled like something else. I had a gut feeling it was Ron. But I didn't have proof. Then, one night, I got lucky. Caught red-handed. I was up late working in my home office when I heard shuffling outside. My husband was asleep, and I knew it wasn't him. I turned off the lights, peeked through the blinds, and saw a shadowy figure standing by my driveway. They were bending down near my trash cans. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone, opened my security camera app, and started recording. Then the porch light flicked on. The figure jumped back like they'd been electrocuted. It was Ron. I watched as he sprinted back to his yard, jumped over his ugly chain-link fence, and disappeared into his house. I ran outside to check. He had been pouring something on my trash bins. A strong, awful smell hit me, rotten milk. I had him. I saved the footage. Every second of it. Ron, caught in the act. But I didn't call the cops yet. I wanted to wait. See if he'd try something else. I didn't have to wait long. Escalation. The next night, I set up extra cameras. Not just my usual security system, I put up a few cheap motion-activated ones in my yard, angled toward the fence. At around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I opened the app and saw Ron, again. This time, he wasn't alone. He had a friend with him. They were holding a canister. At first, I thought, oh no, is that gasoline? But when the wind shifted, I caught a different smell. Bleach. They were pouring bleach along my fence line. I didn't understand at first. Then it hit me, he was trying to kill my grass and plants. I watched, stunned, as they dumped an entire gallon of bleach along the base of my yard, right next to the fence. That was it. I wasn't waiting anymore. Calling the cops. I hit record, got every second of it, then called the police. 911, what's your emergency? My neighbor is trespassing on my property and damaging it. I have video evidence. Within 10 minutes, a patrol car pulled up. I met the officer outside and showed him the footage. The officer's face went blank. This is clear as day, he said. He's trespassing and destroying property. We'll go talk to him. I stood at the edge of my yard, watching as the officer knocked on Ron's door. At first, there was no answer. Then, after the third knock, Ron cracked the door open. I could barely hear him mumbling something. Then the officer said something back, and suddenly Ron was shouting. I didn't do anything. She's lying. That camera is fake. The officer wasn't having it. He told Ron to step outside. I saw Ron shake his head, cross his arms, refuse to move. Then the cop said something that made my stomach flip. Sir, if you don't cooperate, I have no choice but to place you under arrest for vandalism and trespassing. For the first time since this started, Ron looked scared. Then his porch light flickered on. And that's when I saw her. Ron's wife. I had never seen her before. Not once in all the years he'd lived next to me. She stood in the doorway, watching everything. And when she stepped forward, her eyes locked onto mine. And she smiled. Ron's wife steps into the picture. I didn't even know Ron had a wife. For 5 years, I had never seen her. Not once. No small talk, no chance encounters, nothing. It was as if she had never existed. But there she was, standing in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. And then she smiled at me. Not a friendly smile. Not a nervous smile. A knowing smile. It made my stomach turn. Ron was still arguing with the cop, insisting that I had edited the footage to frame him. The officer wasn't buying it. The evidence was too clear. His footprints were still visible in the dirt along the fence line. The bleach smell was still strong in the air. Then, his wife spoke. Officer, may I have a moment with my husband? The cop frowned but nodded. She stepped outside, grabbed Ron by the arm, and pulled him aside. They spoke in low, hurried whispers. Ron's face twisted in anger, but the longer she talked, the more his expression changed. And then, just like that, he shut up. A second later, she turned back to the cop and said, "We won't be pressing charges against her." This was all a misunderstanding. I blinked. Pressing charges against me? The officer gave her a blank stare. "Ma'am, your husband is the one under investigation." She just nodded and gave him another eerily calm smile. "Yes, but this whole thing got out of hand. He won't do it again. No need to escalate this." I could tell the officer wasn't happy about this, but technically, Ron hadn't done enough damage to warrant an immediate arrest. They took a report, warned him about trespassing again, and left. I was fuming. Ron didn't look at me once as he followed his wife back inside. But before she shut the door, she glanced over her shoulder and mouthed something to me. "Be careful." Then she disappeared. The sudden apology. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened it and almost slammed it shut again. It was Ron. But he wasn't alone. His wife was with him. He looked different. Not smug. Not angry. Just hollow. Before I could say anything, his wife spoke. "We wanted to apologize." I raised an eyebrow. For what? Suing me? Vandalizing my property? Trying to frame me? Ron flinched. His wife, however, just nodded. Yes. All of it. I folded my arms. Why? There was a long pause. Then she did something I never expected. She pulled out a checkbook. "We'd like to pay for the damages," she said, already writing. "And we'd appreciate it if you didn't take this to court." I stared at her. This wasn't adding up. Ron had spent years making my life miserable. He had sued me for thousands of dollars. He had called me every name in the book, poured bleach on my property, and now, suddenly, he wanted to pay me off? Something was wrong. I didn't take the check. What's really going on? I asked. Ron didn't speak. He wouldn't even look up. His wife let out a tired sigh. Then, quietly, she said, "This isn't about you." It never was. The secret next door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words wouldn't leave my mind. This isn't about you. Then what was it about? I started thinking back to all the times I had heard strange noises from Ron's house. The late night yelling. The sounds of things breaking. How his blinds were always shut. How no one ever visited. I got up and looked out my bedroom window. His house was completely dark. Then, just as I was about to go back to bed, a light flickered on. Not inside the house. In the backyard. The backyard mystery. I crept to my own backyard and peeked through the gaps in the fence. Ron was digging. Not a little hole. A deep pit. I checked the time. It was 2:14 a.m. He was out there, alone, in the cold, digging. I didn't know what he was doing, but something in my gut told me I did not want to find out. Then, just as suddenly as he started, he stopped. He dropped the shovel, wiped his forehead, and looked around. Then he did something that sent chills down my spine. He turned directly toward the fence, right where I was watching. And he smiled. The vanishing act. The next day, I didn't see Ron. Or his wife. Or any sign of life in that house. No lights turned on. No movement. Nothing. By the second day, I was getting antsy. By the third day, I decided to knock on their door. No answer. The porch light was still on, the way it had been since that night. I checked with a neighbor down the street. Hey, have you seen Ron lately? They shook their head. Nope. But weird thing, the other night, I saw a moving truck pull up to his house. I felt my stomach drop. Moving truck? Yeah, the neighbor said. Middle of the night. No one came out, but the truck was there for hours. Then it just left. Ron and his wife were gone. No goodbye. No explanations. Just gone. The final discovery. A few weeks later, a new family moved in. I was still rattled by everything that had happened, but I figured this was a fresh start. Then, one evening, I heard a knock at my door. It was my new neighbor. Hey, he said. Sorry to bother you. We were digging in the backyard to plant some trees and found something weird. I felt my hands go cold. What did you find? He handed me something wrapped in a towel. I unwrapped it and felt my stomach churn. It was a burned, half-melted piece of the old fence. Buried deep in Ron's yard. That night, I checked my security camera footage from the night Ron disappeared. And for the first time, I noticed something I had missed before. The moving truck had left. But Ron's wife never got in it. The final revelation. Holding the burned, half-melted fence piece in my hands, I felt a wave of unease settle deep in my stomach. The new neighbor, Tom, stood there, watching me closely. I thought maybe you'd know what this was about, he said, scratching the back of his head. I swallowed. I didn't know how to explain it. Where exactly did you find this? I asked. He gestured toward Ron's old backyard. We were digging near the fence line, about 2 feet down. There's more, too. Charred wood. Nails. Pieces of, he hesitated. Something that looks like cloth. Something cold and sharp sliced through my thoughts. Cloth? I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it's just old debris, I said, even though I didn't believe it. Ron's fence blew down in a storm, so maybe he just buried some of the leftovers. Tom nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Yeah, but my wife thinks we should call someone. Just in case. I agreed. The digging begins. The next morning, the police were back at Ron's old house. This time, they weren't dealing with petty vandalism or a ridiculous lawsuit. They were digging. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, whispering, watching as officers cordoned off the backyard. A forensics team arrived, setting up tents and taking samples. I stood on my porch, heart hammering, afraid of what they might find. And then, they found something. The moment it happened, everything changed. The energy of the officers shifted. Their voices got sharper. More serious. A few of them stepped back from the hole, shaking their heads. Then, one of them pulled out a tarp. I had seen enough crime shows to know what that meant. By the end of the day, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with wild theories. Some thought Ron had buried illegal materials back there. Others whispered about missing people. Then, later that night, the news broke. The police had found human remains. Not just any remains. A woman's body. The next day, they released more details. The body had been buried for at least 5 years, around the time Ron moved in. And then the biggest shock of all, the police released a missing persons report. The woman's name? Cynthia Marsh. Ron's real wife. The second I saw the news, everything clicked. The mystery woman, the one I had thought was Ron's wife, wasn't his wife at all. She was someone else. Someone who had been pretending. Ron had been living with a stranger. Someone who had taken Cynthia's place. Someone who had convinced him to cover up whatever had happened. And she had warned me. Be careful. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about her. Where had she gone? Who was she? Then, the next morning, I got my answer. I walked out to get my mail, and there, standing by my driveway, was her. The fake wife. Only now, she wasn't smiling. She looked tired. Pale. Almost, relieved. Before I could say anything, she held up her hands. I didn't kill her. I froze. She took a shaky breath. Ron did. I stared at her. I didn't know whether to run, scream, or listen. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Her eyes flicked toward the street, where a police car was parked near Ron's old house. They were watching. Because it's over, she said. Then, before I could react, she walked straight toward the cops. And turned herself in. It took weeks for the full story to come out. Ron had killed Cynthia shortly after they moved in. No one knew exactly how, the body was too damaged to tell. But the leading theory was that it had been an accident at first. A fight that went too far. Instead of calling the police, Ron had buried her in the backyard. And then, somehow, he found another woman. A woman who agreed to pose as Cynthia. A woman who helped him cover it up. Her real name was Megan Keller. She had been with Ron for years, playing the role of his wife. And for whatever reason, she stayed. Until now. Ron was arrested. He tried to deny everything, but with Cynthia's remains found and Megan's confession, he didn't stand a chance. Megan, despite turning herself in, was charged as well. She had helped hide a body. She had lied to the police. But because she cooperated, she got a reduced sentence. She never gave a full reason why she had stayed with Ron. Some said he had blackmailed her. Others thought she had been too afraid to leave. The truth? I don't think even she knew. A few months later, I stood in my backyard, looking at the new fence I had built, a real, sturdy fence. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. Ron was gone. His ugly chain-link fence was gone. The mystery of his missing wife was solved. But every once in a while, I still think about Megan. Why had she warned me that night? Why had she finally turned herself in? Maybe, deep down, she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. And in the end, she had picked me. I still don't know if I should feel grateful, or haunted. But one thing is for sure. I'll never ignore a bad feeling about a neighbor again.